After everybody had realized that they had been played for suckers, played for fools, and these assholes ended up playing for keeps, everyone realized they now had a goal, they now had a purpose, and they got to work. With nothing but men around, a few that were still remaining believed that they had truly entered heaven of all places. That is, until they found out what happens without women to temper a man's steel, a man's rage. Fighting becomes very common, as many fight through their feelings of loss and pain, and when another comes up and makes some sort of comment, something that is unwelcome, if they don't immediately apologize, well, let's just say the phrase, "give me an excuse," became the words of the day. The weakest, or the most timid of men, were hardened up very, very quick. They immediately learned how to fight, and learned, of course, how to talk all sorts of crap back to everybody else. And this brought something from everyone. It brought respect from their peers, and this was now essential with a society like this. Society had to morph, society had to change, society had to become more than what it was, even with everything they've lost. Those men still remaining that were obsessed with their appearance found out really quick that nobody remaining truly gives a shit about their appearance. And if the man behind that pretty mask they were showing turned out to be worthless and unwilling to work hard or unwilling to contribute at all, found out really quick that nobody cares about their feelings and are very willing to mess up whatever pretty-ish face they might have. Along with that, bullies found out very quick that there was absolutely no protection for them anymore. The changes in laws, especially all the way around the world, made it easy to defend yourself, especially when many tried to force others into servitude. Warlords and kings believed that they had command over everybody and immediately started to dictate what they should do. They wanted to demand everybody to bow down to them as they were now in charge. But without women to temper their rage, many of the men around the world just went, "I don't think so." Many of those that tried to force entire regions into servitude, force them into slavery, wound up bleeding out as there was no reason to keep men like that alive. Everyone had a mission, everyone had a purpose, and that purpose was not to destroy each other. No, 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 no. They had something else they had to destroy. The majority of the world that remained didn't really have to worry about any of these issues because the population was so focused on one goal and that one goal only. And that goal was vengeance. To accomplish this goal, they needed to be strong, they needed to be fit, they needed to be well trained, and they basically had to be young body with an old man's mind. This would have been impossible if not for the fact that the technologies had finally been released. Because of these technology, regeneration was now possible. Missing parts, fingers, arms, legs, even genitalia and entire parts of the body could be repaired and fixed. In some cases, people that had become a quadriplegic could now walk. Of course, they were mad that they had been kept away from this technology for so long, but now, instead of being angry in a chair, they can be angry on their feet. Rejuvenation was also something that no one was expecting. The old and broken could now bring themselves back to the times when they were absolutely at the peak of their own physicality. Many understood that this was right around 25 years of age for those in the Western world. However, for other races around the world, that may be a little different. Regardless, it didn't matter. One thing that did shock them all, though, is when they went into the pods that were needed for such a device to work. They came out, and the first time they looked in the mirror, everyone thought the same thing. Is this me? This was me. No, no, no. This is me. Everyone realized that now that they're young, now that they have an old man's mind in a younger body, now that they were able to get rid of any disease that was in the body that was breaking them down, things like MS, tuberculosis, anything was gone, with the exception of the common cold because it just mutated so damn fast. Anything that was manufactured, most anything that started with H, well, that was definitely gone from all of humanity. They need to make sure all this was gone anyway, and thanks to the frequency healing, it was absolutely easy. Once they actually did a blood test, found out what they were trying to destroy, and you're in that pod, you feel a little fuzzy as it goes through, but that's all those bugs dying out of you. Even with all this, though, there was still not enough personnel. They needed more. They needed more to build. They needed more to fight. Unfortunately, even after half the population was gone, another 13% of the surviving population either refused the new tech or deleted themselves. They did not want to be around and survive in a world like this anymore. They did not want to deal with the fact that they had watched their loved ones die violently. They did not want any piece of what was coming. And everyone understood this because the old phrase, still waters run deep, is something every real man understands. Sometimes the loss was just too much. For some, the loss had pushed them well beyond what they can handle. This is similar to any soldier who believes they can go into a battle and be Johnny Rambo, John Wick, or any other John like 117 that goes in those movies and just take out everyone with no altercation, no issue. But every single man suffered PTSD, and they understand that it's just not in everyone. Everyone that was still there would awake some nights screaming or crying, wanting to reach out to their loved ones, but they weren't there. Many turned to alcohol and drugs, but drugs were becoming more and more difficult to get. The main reason is that nobody wanted them around. Everybody realized what it was doing to them, and there was already troubles going on that they needed to face. Not to mention, they looked at those who fell into the bottle and would not leave, or those that fell to pills, injections, or whatever went up their nose, and showed very little respect to these folks. It showed that they have a lack of integrity, and without integrity, they did not get respect, and respect was what the society needed to survive. Along with survival, they needed a population. In order to increase the population, they turned back to the new technology. Now, AI did assist in many things, speeding up logistics, streamlining assembly processes, and things of that nature. And they were able to deal with a few of the basic necessities as everybody had their own live-in robot. Many of these robots were simply moving on either tracks or on wheels. But within a decade, most homes had at least one partially automated humanoid robot. Nobody thought technology would extend from simple devices that would simply suck up the garbage off your floor, all the way to robots which, more often than not, had a female-esque form. Well, at least eventually. Many times the balance of the gyro was off and they would keep falling down. And many of those that had them did not want any type of humanoid face on them, as the uncanny valley was just too much for them. Those that wanted to enjoy the bots usually treated them even better than those that just used them for mundane tasks. The common phrase to hear from those that actually had a robot in their house with a humanoid face was, "Here's the missus," as they pointed to the bot. For a time, this helped, at least in that moment in time, as they waited to get some sort of new technology set up. Many of those who were basically just trying to live their lives did not understand what was coming and just had to take things as they were, while others pushed forward with technology as fast as they could. Yet even with the rejuvenation of the technology, making everyone young, fit, and strong, even with the repair and regeneration, allowing basically immortality, with few exceptions. I mean, if you put somebody through a wood chipper, you're not exactly bringing them back. But someone who basically bled out could be regenerated enough if you give them the right materials and get them into the regenerator fast enough. And even with the technology filling part of the female gap, not all of them, of course, there was still an area that needed to be addressed, a simple human desire. And everybody wondered, how are they going to have children around? A basic desire for most to actually have something to carry on their lineage was still there. It didn't go away. The virus, bacteria, whatever it was, did not rip that out of their system, and everyone just wanted them around. They wanted kids. They wanted something. As good as the tech is, what they got was basically cloning with a few upgrades, of course. When going in, it was normal for men to give a sample of their own blood. And then they looked and were told, you can do whatever you want. Here's basically a bunch of dials and slides. Do what you want. For most everybody, it was very simple. They increased the speed of someone, like reaction time, strength, along with bone density and stuff like that. Memory was a big deal, along with hand-eye coordination. Along with this, everybody, without exception, wanted to enhance the joints as they realized that was going to be taking most of the stress. However, they found out very quickly that too much adjustment and nothing was going to survive in the tube. At most, you had about a 10% adjustment, and that was it. Some of the adjustments were extreme, to say the least, but it was a single adjustment across the entire. Even with all this wonderful technology, there was still a major issue, and several small ones, although some say they're all major. Whatever viral bacterium that was used against humanity made it a bad idea to clone females. You see, even if you raised it from infancy all the way to breeding age, within 24 hours of birth, the female dies in a painful, absolutely horrible fashion, just like they seen before. For many men, if it wasn't for the fact that the child was still alive, they would have deleted themselves immediately. This was horrible enough, but for the clones, male and female, there was also one other issue that for several decades humanity could not wrap their head around. They could create the body, of course, but they could not create the soul. Each one, even if raised from infancy out of the tube, would be little more than a flesh robot. Lights are on, but nobody's home. You could tell them it's time to eat, but sometimes you would have to teach them, show them exactly, piece by piece by piece, how to eat correctly. Let them know, hey, if it starts to hurt in any way, you're full. Don't eat until your stomach explodes. It was a very, very detailed process. And as it turns out, once you got through the startup process, they turned out to be some of the absolute best laborers you could ever ask for. They all were able to follow orders and do slight problem solving once they finally reached puberty. Well, at least problem solved to a point. There was no actual creativity. There was no imagination. No real personality in any of them, and it was starting to drive humanity crazy. They were easy to work with, sure, but not very good for conversation. Simple yes or no conversations would all you'd really have from them. When raising females, there was another psychological issue, especially when they took the DNA of their lost loved ones to try and bring them back, so to speak. There was just issue after issue with that one. Since, well, like the males, they have been brought up from infancy and they're just not quite there. As they're raised from that point, they're kind of looked at as daughters. Of course, with better looking exteriors, of course, because they were all upgraded. So, unless you can disconnect yourself from the father daughter issue, raising a girl made to replace your wife that you can't unsee as your daughter truly, truly messes up the mind of good men. When said female clone gives birth, it's just as difficult to watch them die as the original, even though you can see they might be in pain, but they're not actually calling out for help or anything like that. They simply thrash and kick and throttle themselves, and then sometimes they scratch at the chest for just a little bit before it's over. This is still absolutely horrible, but there is one solid benefit above all else above this. When the child is born, it can be raised as a normal child, as it is a normal child. Somehow, it does have a soul. Even if it came from a doll, at least if it mated with a real person, and it wasn't mated with another doll. There was a real person there. And yet, one of the issues was it wasn't really the father, but you were their grandfather. And because of this, is the only reason many men didn't delete themselves en masse at the loss of their lover right in front of them. They knew it was going to happen too, and in some cases they tried desperately to give all sorts of morphine and everything else to calm them down, make the passing just a little bit more comfortable, but it was still horrific. The truly disconcerting part was that 98.6% of all children born from these dolls are male. Females, when born, are immediately placed in protective custody until there's enough family members around them and arrive to protect them, to take them home. Even though they will live sheltered lives, they will live lives. It is of note that anybody who assaulted a female or even attempted to assault a female, doll or not, is the same as if they tried to do the same to a man, and will also be the fastest way to castration without anesthetic, and right before they head to the gallows. This only happens a few times, but it is very well noted. They're held down, held spread open, locked onto a cage, as their genitals are sliced off with a rusty blade, usually by a family member. Then those that had just lost everything are forced to walk as they find their own testiculars falling out of their pants. If they're lucky, they would bleed out and pass out from shock at this point and die there. Everybody, as they watch this, as this bastard was being walked towards the gallows, would turn their backs as a true sign of disrespect. After the hanging, they're not buried with any type of respect either. The body is simply tossed into the swamp for the critters to simply tear apart and slowly consume and turn into shit. The genitalia that actually committed this crime was immediately burned. Though gruesome, things like this were absolutely necessary to keep everyone from tearing each other apart. And it worked. Administrative punishments like whippings or hangings were very, very uncommon, but they did happen. Though eventually they became so uncommon, it would surprise anyone if it was going to happen. Reason being is that families started to stay together as much as they could, protecting each other and making sure that each other was safe and not did anything really stupid. Families, especially large ones, became clans of sorts. Now, ones would think, once they become clans, that old issues would appear, but they didn't, because times had changed, and there was no need for the old school ways of doing things as far as clans, Hatfields and McCoys type things to actually happen. Along with this, bullies in a town would find out real fast that no one had a problem shooting back. There was no way to simply be like the mafia guys on the television, where they would simply muscle into an area. No, they would simply find out that if they tried to muscle in and wave any type of pistol around and try to spin their weight and say how they're bad and everybody should bow down to them, well, they usually wouldn't even make it to their car in the morning. Technology might be able to handle most of the old issues, but any of the old issues that still remain, well, old school tactics still work. Yet one of the reasons why items like this almost never showed up is because everyone also had a purpose and they were fully dedicated to it. Everybody took a different position in a way to assist the mission from happening. Some raised the food to feed to the actual food that they would eat, or they supported the effort in other ways. That could be digging materials, processing it, or simply building everything. Sometimes training, it didn't matter. The revenge was coming. It was going to take a while, but the revenge will be loud and nasty. A human type of kill. Revenge is being built in the form of a fleet of ships. On the ground, it doesn't look like much, just a bunch of metal walls sitting on top of some sort of concrete that makes sure it doesn't sink into the dirt. But if one were to take some sort of flight and go above, it would be clear what is being taken place. Across different small shipyards, different types of ships can be seen. From the smallest corvette classes, which can easily be seen to only have one main gun and a lot of point defense. Along with that, there was a lot of open areas, for once the shell was done, ISR equipment at an extreme multitude had to be installed. These were going to be the scout craft mainly, but if need be, they could hold their own in a fight. Along with that, certain areas were absolutely packed with shuttles being made or already finished. These were either cargo shuttles or personnel shuttles. These were usually very bulbous type ships. They had to have room for all the personnel and cargo, of course, as they were simply transport. But it was clear what their purpose was. Looking around more, you might find a few frigates. Now these are actually purpose-built ships, but these look more like warbirds than anything else. Each frigate had its own particular purpose, even though it had all the type of weapons, but one usually stuck out. Either it was a drone carrier, a missile carrier, an aircraft carrier, or whatever it might have to carry around. Sometimes even a mine layer, even though most fought against the need for mines. The main ships that were being built was the destroyers. Fast attack vehicles, and you could see as the hull was being made, as it was clear that this thing was just going to be engines and guns, and just covered in a multitude of layers upon layers of weapons. And many looked to see where the crew compartment might be, and everybody thought the same thing. Well, that's real Spartan, isn't it? Across the entire globe, only a single cruiser had been started. It looks almost like a destroyer, but far more robust, at least 6 times as large, and only one of the massive turrets that they actually wanted. Passing by, it was very easy to see where the massive turret was going to go, although more people wanted more turrets on turrets, as that's simply a human thing. They had to make do with what they had. Their technology may be great, but their resources are finite and limited. They needed to use them very sparingly. It will still be a long while before everything is ready and everyone continues to work towards the mission. While this is happening, there's an attempt to contact the other species that they knew. They use direct beam transmissions as a way to not give away any intel to anyone else who might be listening. And it takes only a moment for them to receive data due to quantum entanglement. But they had to wait for a response. It was as though nobody was sitting there listening to the radio. When they did get a response from everybody, the responses were spotty, at best. There was talk back and forth that had to be translated, talk about the cataclysm that struck their planet. It seems as though they all had that. There was massive losses of personnel, and they almost always heard half the total population. Whenever this happened, there was a clear change in the tone of the voice on the other side. They didn't have to say any more, and never were asked any additional information. For all of them, they said their infrastructure was also falling apart and that they had missing moons. Without the moons, they wouldn't be able to do whatever their technology was designed to do. So they were having trouble keeping everything together. Though wanting to help was in human nature, there wasn't anything humanity could do at this moment. When they contacted a particular species, the analysts with the 30-pound brains started to get suspicious. When they contacted the lizards, communications were not broken, they were solid and crisp. They talked about loss of their 2 moons, of course, and asked humanity how they survived the calamity. Jokingly, the one on the radio simply said, "We are stronger than we look." They continued the conversation after that, of course, and as they spoke, the lizards never asked for assistance. They only seemed to care about how humanity survived. Wanted to know what they had done, what type of technology they were doing, and all these different items. Several of the other species that humanity tried to contact simply didn't answer. It stands to reason, of course, if they went through the same thing that humanity did and they didn't alter themselves, well, it's been about 200 years after all, and they all knew what was going to happen to many of them. Not a single person was under any type of illusion about that. Yet that question will still have to go unanswered for a while. It will be another century until this depleted population is ready to leave Earth and find out what in the hell actually happened and who's responsible. Right now, they still have preparations to make, so they all simply get back to work. Many of them start getting a little numb at the whole centuries gone by and all they did was work. This was normal to experience the flat line, and everyone knew it was coming, but of course nobody enjoyed it. They all knew it would pass eventually, but eventually might not come soon enough for many. By the time the fleet was ready, the Earth looked like something from old science fiction. Looking around the planet, it had grown back and rejuvenated itself. It seemed as though the only species that ever got damaged on this planet was, in fact, human. All the other species were now strong and fertile and reaching across the planet in massive numbers. Around the planet, humans had retreated a little bit more, and they had now clean, advanced cities that were scattered around the planet. These were not the standard skylines you were used to, but these were kind of in tune with nature itself. These were very large areas, mostly automated, normally surrounded on all sides by farms that grew the feed that fed the food. Though fruits and vegetables were still in common use, grains and sugars, outside of things like honey and cinnamon, had all fallen out of favor, as once you have to live off real food for a while, when they tried to go back to artificial, everyone realized that it was killing them, and they simply said no. Pollution was also no longer a concern, as there is no profit in it anymore, thanks to the new technology. They weren't burning any type of fuels anymore, using zero-point generators and repulsor technology to move around the planet. They didn't need to worry about digging up massive amounts of ores, except for that to build the ships themselves, and all they really had to do was pick up all the vehicles left around and start melting them down, sorting out the ores, and then reconstituting it into parts they needed for the ships. When they did that and they started breaking down many of the old cities, there was more than enough raw materials for them to make the ships they needed. It would just take a long time to build the ships. Looking at the population and looking close, You could see that they all wore very practical clothing and very practical devices. Almost nothing was glittery, shiny, or decorative at all. The population had become so pragmatic that it was shown in everything. Even if one was to look down at the individual human walking around, they would see that they're all strong and fit, as being overweight is actually a sign of weakness. Now, not if someone is generally a quote-unquote big guy, but being overweight is looked down on. If someone is fighting that, they still get the respect of someone who tries to fight that extra weight and turn it into solid muscle. This was as close to vanity as anybody got anymore. Eventually, it was time. Those that would be leaving the planet were almost exclusively the originals. The title The Originals was given to those that had lived through the cataclysm and watched their families die, and watched them die screaming. The reason for this is their desire for revenge still permeated their speech, their mannerisms, hell, even their music. Of course, their music hasn't changed in a couple of centuries, but usually something violent and hateful as they worked, realizing that they are working towards the goal of ripping some Xeno a new one. This is why they would go and leave the young ones behind. Though those on the ground were saddened to see their grandfathers leave, the grandfathers knew that the grandkids would be safe, as military arts was now a requirement during their education, many of them mastering several different ones from boxing to jiu-jitsu, Krav Maga. It didn't matter what it was. It had to be an actual fighting style, though, not something that was just for show. Not only that, but they also mastered engineering, sciences of all sorts, and mathematics. Those who were now going to be left behind were actually a upgraded version of humanity, and only a few of the originals would stay behind. They would be needed to focus the adrenaline, the anger, the rage, the purpose of those who were down younger than them. This needed to be done because now humanity was more of a warrior society than anyone could have imagined. At any given moment, should they receive an attack from outside the planet, every single one that was there beyond the age of 10 could easily jump in any vehicle and operate it with practice proficiency. Along with that, with almost every single weapon system out there they could use. It would take a while before they knew all of them, of course, but they were still extremely well versed. Not only that, but taking the children out for survival was another common tactic. Survival camping was so common, in fact, that entire regions the size of Montana were sectioned off around the world just to allow people to do this. That is why the originals were not worried about leaving them behind, at least for now. They would return as victors, they knew it, and they promised it to the young ones, even though the young ones had not lived through any of this before. They more or less understood watching the old movie. As the ships lifted off, many inside one shuttle joked when they mentioned how good of a warrior society they had, and another man turned and said, "Yep, the Spartans would be proud." It would take 5 months. 5 months of travel time to reach the first home planet of their old friends. This is the closest planet to Earth, which had 2 different species living there. To surprise everybody, it was both a canine species and a feline species. Originally, they both grew on opposite sides of the planet, but when they met each other, of course, they went to blows with each other for a long, long time. There was a truce after centuries of useless fighting, which actually brought more prosperity to both sides once they started sharing technology and working with each other. It was absolutely astounding when you started reading through their history. It was actually a trade of information with these species that allowed the creation of the main engines that were currently sending the human fleet hurtling through space. After the long trip, everyone was ready to get going. During the trip, all they did was constant physical training, fighting amongst each other to make themselves sharp and preparing their gear over and over and over again. Reaching the planet Membart, they looked and nobody could understand what they were seeing. The planet seemed dead. The few ships that were outside the planet just sat there, looking close, and you could realize that they were simply adrift, many of them in orbit of the planet itself. They saw how some had burned down in and others were just floating there in space. They tried to hail these ships and there was nothing there. Nothing responded. The satellite network was still intact, still around the planet, but when the helmsman called, nothing. It was like the satellites didn't work. They didn't respond at all. They didn't even move any of their dishes, antennas, or anything like that. There was almost no electronic signatures on the planet, and there is definitely none in space. Everyone looked over to the fleet admiral, and he basically said, "Fuck it, we're going in." With that, everybody knew what to do when they got ready. Alarms sounded, and everyone geared up for a possible fight, and they were very much ready for a fight. Yet on the way down inside the shuttles, though being jerked around by the atmosphere as they went down, there was no weapons fire. There was no explosions, no bursts of anything. Nobody understood this. They did force the landing down as they wanted to get to the ground as soon as possible, but this was just odd. Shouldn't they be defending themselves? Once the dropships landed and opened, groups spread out and entered the cities that seemed to be torn apart by time. It was though foliage had started taking everything back, ripping down parts of the structures. Not quite the superstructures yet, but there was very little in the way of windows anymore, although the species didn't really care for glass. It seemed as though most of the windows were simply covered in foliage. They kept looking and moving through the city, and everyone was on edge for a few simple reasons. And those simple reasons were there was no bodies. There should be bodies on the ground. If people died in the street, there should be something, bones at least, something. It hasn't been that long. There should be something here. But also, it's so quiet. It's too quiet. It's as though there's no anything around. There's no predators. There's no prey. There's no birds out there or insects or anything. Usually you listen to the woods and you hear hundreds of different species making their calls, desperate to get laid, but there's nothing. What the hell was going on? They kept trying to contact more and more and more, but they were getting nothing at all. They couldn't figure it out. Every single channel, every single frequency, there was nothing. They sent out beacons of all sorts trying to find anything, but still nothing. For hours and hours, they kept searching through buildings. Nothing. The houses themselves were a bit small for the heavily armored soldiers, but the lighter ones, the light forces, they broke into the houses, and what they found? Nothing. Some places looked ransacked. Some places looked like something had just been there. And they just got up and left. What happened? Did they rapture these people? What was going on? It wasn't until the patrols reached one of the far sides of the cities. It was a living area similar to a bunch of apartments if you want to have some sort of human analog. And then everybody heard over the radio, a squad leader radioing, "Contact, contact, contact," and sending up a beacon, letting everybody know exactly where he was. The command called in, "Report status." They immediately turned over to see what was coming in on the camera. The squad leader turned on his camera to show that the two species that own this planet are jumping out of the windows and landing on the soldiers below, seeming to want to tear them apart. The squad leader then yelled into his radio, "It's raining cats and dogs around here, sir!" Hello everybody, this is Syntax. Thank you so much for joining me on the second chapter of this story. Before I go, I need to send out some quick thank yous to a few of my supporters, and those will be SS Demon, MTF Guard, Erica Gem, Guardian Sage, and Brian Kemp. Thank you all so much for supporting the channel. Everybody else, I will see you on the next one. This is Syntax, ejecting.